All right, so welcome to the deep dive. You know the drill. We take a whole bunch of information and try to condense it down to those key insights that you really need to know.
And get this done fast, right?
Exactly, like a fast track to really understanding something. And hopefully, along the way, we kind of find those surprising bits of information.
Well, today's a bit different, right? You brought a whole book to the table.
Yeah. We're diving into The Great Game of Business by Jack Stack.
Oh, cool.
It's a business book. But you know those ones that just kind of gather dust on the shelf?
Yeah.
This isn't that kind of book. This is the kind of book people are like, they're really into it, They dog-ear it. They put sticky notes in it. They're highlighting, underlining.
Back to it.
Yeah, years later. So it's got this reputation for being super practical and, actually making a real difference.
So what's the big idea? I mean, what is it about this book that makes it so, I don't know, dog-eared?
All right, so the core concept is actually pretty brilliant. Stack's idea is basically to turn your company into a game. And it's a game that your employees can play and win. And this all grew out of his own struggles, He was trying to get people to just understand basic business, metrics.
Yeah.
And he realized he needed to tap into that same energy that they have when they're doing their jobs, like, building a product, serving customers, whatever it is they do, that passion. And instead of just doing it for the task at hand, get them invested in the success of the whole company.
Get them bought in.
Yeah. And I think the real switch was getting them to think of the company itself as the product.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, instead of like their individual tasks, they're thinking about the health of the whole thing. So what kind of impact does that have then?
Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. Let's look at SRC Holdings Corporation, the company that Stack actually started. So back in 1983, their stock was trading at 10 cents a share. Okay. Fast forward to today, and it's somewhere around $348. Now think about this. If you had put $1,000 into SRC back then, it would be worth something like $3.4 million today.
Huge.
Yeah. Now, to put that in perspective, that same $1,000 in, say, an S&P 500 index fund would be worth about $8,434. And in Berkshire Hathaway, around $113,000.
Right?
Okay, so those are respectable returns, but they're not anywhere near $3.4 million.
Yeah, that's incredible growth.
Right, like that's a huge light bulb moment,
Right.
right? And it shows you just how powerful these ideas in this book could be.
So the mission here, it sounds like, is to understand the core principles that Stack lays out in this book and see how they can lead to that kind of, crazy success, both for the business and, financially.
Yeah. We want to understand what this great game of business is, like how does it work, what are the key ingredients. So where do we start with this, with understanding this great game?
Well, Stack is very clear that the GGOB is not just a bunch of like tricks or, techniques.
Right.
It's like an entire operating system for your business. And it all starts with something called open book management.
Okay. Open book management. I mean, it sounds pretty simple and, just open the books, everyone can see it, but I'm guessing it's a bit more complex than that, right?
You're right. You have to start with being transparent with your financials.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could communicate with people by using the numbers. But the thing is, Stack really stresses that this only works if you've already got a really solid foundation of trust and respect in your organization.
Right.
You can't just throw a bunch of numbers at people if they don't believe in you or each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trust is like the foundation.
It really is.
Okay, so you have to have that trust. But what's next? What's the next step to make this open book thing really work?
The next step is to show people the big picture.
Okay.
So before you even start talking about the numbers, you need to explain to your employees how the whole company works,
Yeah.
their role in it, and why it matters. Stack says it's like giving everyone in the company a course in the business.
I like that. It's all about context, right? Like you need to understand why these numbers matter before you even start looking at them.
Exactly. And he actually goes a step further and suggests that you should market your company's products to your employees like you would to customers.
Interesting.
Make sure they really understand what it is you do and how you're helping customers. So it's not just about the money. It's about understanding the whole thing.
The whole machine.
Yeah, the whole machine. And to solidify this big picture understanding, Stack loves using visuals, charts, graphs. He even remembers a graph of overhead costs that literally went up to the ceiling in their cafeteria.
Wow, that's a pretty big graph.
It was. But it's about making things clear and easy to understand, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the groundwork laid. Everyone understands the big picture. So how do we actually use the numbers to make things happen, to get people to do stuff?
That's what Stack calls the language cure. It's about actively using the numbers to drive understanding and then action. He talks about magic numbers, which are basically the key metrics that show how cost competitive your company is.
Uh-huh.
And to find those magic numbers, you have to know your competitors' costs so you can compare and see where you stand.
So knowing where you stand financially compared to your rivals.
Yeah, exactly. And a big plus of being open with your financials is that it gets rid of those nasty surprises.
Right.
By giving people the knowledge and tools to understand how their work impacts those numbers and to predict how things might go in the future, you get much more control and consistency in your company.
Okay, so this all sounds good, but I can imagine some people would be really scared to share their financial information. Like, what about competitors seeing your numbers? Or even your own employees misinterpreting the data? What about that?
Those are legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
But Stack says that the long-term benefits of being open with your employees outweigh those risks.
Okay.
He says that when you hide financial information, people start making assumptions, and they're usually wrong.
Yeah, I guess when people don't have the full picture, they tend to fill in the gaps themselves.
Exactly. And usually not in a good way. Stack says that a lot of times employees overestimate how much profit the company makes and think there's more money for things like wages and bonuses when there actually isn't.
Yeah, okay, so not being transparent just creates more problems in the long run.
Right. So he suggests a specific process for teaching people how to read financial statements.
Uh-huh.
He says, start with the income statement because it's easier to understand. Then use that to explain the balance sheet. And always tie it back to things that matter to employees, like job security or how the company creates wealth.
So make it real for them.
Exactly. SRC actually goes really deep with this. They break down the cost of goods sold line, which is usually just one line on the statement, into separate parts: raw materials, labor, and overhead. And each week, departments make their own forecasts of how they think they'll be doing against the budget in each of those areas.
Wow, that's pretty detailed.
It is. But it makes that connection between their daily work and the company's finances much stronger.
Yeah, okay, so everyone is kind of in the loop then.
Right. And Stack tells this great story about an employee named Don Wood and the toilet paper index.
The toilet paper index?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So Don started carefully tracking how much toilet paper was used in the factory bathrooms.
Oh my gosh, okay.
And he found this weird connection between how busy they were with production and the amount of toilet paper used. Higher productivity meant less time in the bathroom and less toilet paper.
You're kidding me? Toilet paper as, like, a business metric.
It sounds crazy,
Yeah.
but it became a real thing they tracked. And it shows how even looking at small, seemingly unimportant things can actually give you valuable information about your business.
And it worked. Like, it actually helped.
It did. Stack mentions that the year they started doing this coincided with a big jump in their profits and their stock price.
Whoa, that's wild.
Yeah, it shows you the power of getting everyone involved, even in the small things.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so open books get us talking the same financial language. What's the next piece of the puzzle then? How do we make sure everyone is working towards the same goals?
That's where standards come in. Stack defines a standard as that target number for any category you want to measure in your business. It can be a ratio, a percentage, or even a simple number. It's like your benchmark, your goal.
Right. And it can change as your business improves, right?
Exactly. It's not fixed. And Stack says that everyone, no matter their role, needs a way to measure how they're doing, maybe daily, weekly, or monthly.
Okay.
If you don't have these individual metrics, it's hard for people to see how their work is contributing to the whole company.
So it's like having a scoreboard for each person and then a big one for the whole company. Everyone knows how they're doing?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Having these standards helps everyone play the same game. They all understand what's going on. Stack talks about a foreman at a place called Harvester who actually created his own income statement just so he could see how his area was performing.
Wow. So he wanted to keep score even though it wasn't officially there.
Yeah, people naturally want to know how they're doing.
That makes sense.
So standards just give everyone a way to do that together and in a way that helps the whole company.
Yeah.
Stack also brings up a standard cost system. This is really important for businesses that want to be really good at what they do.
Okay.
This system helps you make sure your costs are competitive, and it gets everyone involved in controlling those costs.
Right. He gives that example, right? Something about a corporate charge and how important it is to understand your own costs.
Yeah, perfect example. Before SRC became its own company, they were part of a bigger corporation. And the corporate headquarters charged them a fee of 27 cents on every dollar of product they shipped. It was supposed to cover overhead costs, but no one really knew what it was for.
Right.
After the buyout, they knew they had to get their costs under control if they wanted to survive on their own.
Uh-huh.
And they couldn't have done that without a good standard cost system,
Yeah.
that made all those costs clear for everyone.
So the standards help them figure out how to survive and then thrive.
Exactly. And Stack points out that good standards should make sense to the people using them.
Right.
They become part of their everyday conversations about work. He compares it to a baseball batting average. It's a number, but everyone understands it.
It's a good analogy, yeah.
He also talks about something called the overhead absorption rate and how understanding this can help everyone see how they're impacting profits and bonuses.
So it's not just about producing a lot, it's about doing it efficiently.
Right. If you don't absorb those overhead costs, you make less profit, and that means less money for bonuses.
Okay, so everyone has a real stake in the outcome.
Exactly. And he tells a story about how they compare their labor rates to a competitor in Minnesota. They found out the competitor had higher labor costs, but they were also much more efficient.
Interesting.
So that helped SRC figure out how they could increase wages while still being competitive.
So smart.
Right. It shows how understanding the numbers can help you make good business decisions.
It's not just about cutting costs, it's about strategy.
Exactly.
Right.
And to show how standards can be motivating, Stack talks about this contest between two departments, 54 and 37.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
The foreman of Department 54, a guy named Eddie Novak, was so happy when his team won that he rode around the factory on a bike, ringing a bell.
Huh, that's awesome. Sounds like a good way to boost morale.
It was. But he also gives a warning about a door company that didn't pay enough attention to the cost of scrap wood.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story.
They thought they had a lot of usable wood, but a lot of it was actually scrap. So the lesson is you have to really understand where your numbers are coming from.
Right, yeah.
Don't just take them at face value.
So it's about making sure your data is accurate and that you know what it really means.
Exactly. And finally, Stack says that every business has problems. That's just how it is. But good standards can help you see those problems early on.
Right, like a warning system.
Exactly. They show you where the problems are and how serious they are. Okay, so we've got open books for understanding the financials, clear standards for everyone to aim for. But how do you actually motivate people and make sure they benefit when the company does well?
That's where the fun stuff comes in. Bonuses and incentives.
Which Stack calls the stop-gooder.
The stop-gooder. Okay, I like that.
The idea is to pick a really important financial number that everyone in the company focuses on.
Okay.
Stack wanted SRC to reach a value where every employee could walk away with $55,000, which was the average price of a house in Springfield, Missouri back in 1991.
Whoa, so everyone could buy a house. That's a great goal.
Yeah, it gave everyone a real tangible goal to work towards.
It wasn't just about abstract profits.
Right. And he suggests having only 2 or 3 main bonus goals for the whole year. And those goals should be tied to the financial statements, like making money and having good cash flow.
So those are the real drivers of success, right? Making
Yeah.
money and having cash.
Exactly. And by focusing on these core things, you're also teaching your employees about how the business really works. So it's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone,
Right, yeah.
motivating them and educating them at the same time. Now, Stack says choosing goals from the financial statements often impacts a bunch of other things in a good way, too.
How so?
Like if you focus on improving the current ratio to make sure your company has enough cash, that also helps things like collecting payments faster and managing inventory better.
So it's about choosing goals that have a positive ripple effect on the whole business.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a few rules about setting up bonus programs that actually work.
Okay.
First, he says, set the starting point for earning a bonus at the lowest level that still keeps the company safe. No one should get a bonus just for doing the bare minimum,
Right. The bonus is for going above and beyond.
Exactly. Second, make sure the targets for earning a bonus are realistic but also challenging.
Okay.
They should push people but not be impossible to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Third, give people chances to earn bonuses often enough to keep them interested.
Right. Don't wait till the end of the year.
Exactly. SRC has their stop-gooder program where they give out bonuses every quarter.
Frequent rewards keep people engaged.
Exactly. And fourth, start with a smaller bonus pool and let it grow as the company does better.
Interesting.
This way, people are motivated to keep pushing for better results all year round, even if they miss a few early targets. And none of this works if you don't keep track of the numbers and communicate them clearly.
Right. Transparency builds trust.
It does. Stack talks about having regular announcements and meetings, making sure everyone has access to the data, and that it's easy to understand. He even gives a simple example of how their Stopgooter bonus is calculated. It's based on hitting certain profit targets and a balance sheet goal, like having enough cash on hand.
Okay.
Bonuses are a percentage of an employee's salary, and it's set up so the company still makes money even when people hit all their bonus targets.
So it's a win-win. Everyone benefits.
Exactly. And he makes a good point about making sure your bonus goals match your ability to actually pay them.
Right. You don't want to promise bonuses you can't afford to give.
Yeah, that would be bad. So you need to have a goal that focuses on things like having enough cash alongside your profit goals.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork with understanding the finances, setting clear targets, and having motivating incentives in place. How does all of this come together into a plan for the whole company?
This is where the game plan and the great huddle come in. So Stack explains that this annual game plan, it's not like a normal budget. It's much more than that.
Okay.
It's a complete set of financial projections for the whole year. The income statement, balance sheet, cash flow, everything.
So like a detailed roadmap for the entire business.
Exactly. And the way they create this game plan is really interesting. It's super collaborative. Everyone gets involved.
Stack talks about these sales presentations where managers from all different parts of the company challenge the sales forecasts. They basically play a what-if game to try to find any potential risks or hidden assumptions in the forecast.
So trying to make sure the plan is as realistic as possible.
Yeah. And it's not about being negative or anything. It's about making sure the plan is solid because it's the foundation for everything else.
Right.
And he mentions this guy, Doug Rothert, who had this really important job.
What did he do?
He was in charge of figuring out the standard costs for every single part of the business.
Wow, that's a big job.
It was. He would review every cost, every expense, and work with people from all different departments to make sure those standards were as accurate as possible.
So getting input from the people who actually do the work.
Yeah. So it's about everyone understanding the numbers and having a say in how they're created.
Makes sense.
And Stack emphasizes how important it is to have a really detailed sales plan. You know, not just like we're going to sell a lot. It has to be specific. Like, what are we going to sell? How much? To whom? And when are we going to sell it? And then this plan goes through a two-stage review process.
Okay.
First, middle managers look at it. Then it goes to frontline supervisors and even the employees working on the shop floor.
Wow. So everyone gets a chance to weigh in.
Yeah. And they're not just looking at it, they're really analyzing it. Like, can we actually produce this much? Are these sales targets realistic? Does this plan actually make sense from where we are?
So it's about getting feedback from the people who will actually be doing the work.
Exactly. Stack is an example from 1990. The economy was heading into a recession.
Oh, yeah.
And the employees were worried that the sales forecast was too optimistic.
Uh-huh.
So they talked about it, and they actually ended up lowering the forecast by 15%. And that probably saved the company a lot of trouble later on.
So listening to the employees paid off big time.
Yeah.
So how does this game plan get put into action?
That's where the great huddle comes in.
Okay.
It's this weekly meeting where everyone gets together and figures out their current score for the Stopgooter.
Like how they're doing against their bonus goals.
Exactly. Each department comes to the meeting with their updated numbers for the income statement.
So it's a real-time check on the company's performance.
Yeah. They go around the room, each department announces their numbers, everyone writes them down, and they compare them to the game plan and to the previous week's forecast.
Sounds pretty transparent.
It is, and it's not just about the numbers themselves.
What else?
It's about figuring out the stories behind them.
Okay.
Like, why is purchasing getting such good deals? How did production manage to absorb more overhead? What happened with those sales we were expecting?
So they're not just looking at the numbers, they're trying to understand what's driving them.
Right. And Stack says the most important part is what happens after the huddle.
Okay.
They have these things called chalk talks.
Okay.
Yeah. These are follow-up meetings in each department where they talk about what happened in the huddle and brainstorm ways to improve the score.
So the huddle gives everyone a shared understanding,
Mhm.
and the chalk talks are where they figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, exactly. And they talk about all sorts of things in the huddle. Net sales, cost of goods sold, gross margin, you name it. Stack even mentions their 4 different business units: Maple, Willow, Marshfield, and Newstream. He tells a story about a plant manager who lied about doing chalk talks.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So they started doing surprise audits to make sure they were actually happening.
Got to keep everyone accountable.
Exactly. Okay, so beyond just bonuses, Stack talks about building a company of owners. What does that even mean?
It's not just about giving employees stock options or profit sharing. Stack believes that most people want to contribute and do good work.
Okay.
But he warns against something he calls paranoia in leadership. It's this fear that employees are always trying to cheat the company,
Yeah.
and he says that this fear leads to all these rules and restrictions that actually make things worse.
Uh,
So you're punishing everyone because you're worried about a few bad apples.
yeah, that doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. Instead, he says, focus on building trust and giving people a real stake in the company's success.
Okay.
SRC believes everyone has a better chance of achieving their dreams if they work together as owners of the business. And Stack actually says, you can make more money as a leader by sharing equity with your employees.
Really?
Yeah, because the company is likely to become more successful when everyone is invested in working together.
So it's not just about being nice, it's actually good for business.
Exactly. He talks about Sam Walton and Walmart as a great example. Giving employees stock ownership was a key part of their success.
Right. Everyone was invested in the company's growth.
Yeah, and it created this really motivated workforce. When people feel like owners, they're less likely to get caught up in small disagreements and more likely to focus on the big picture.
So less infighting, more collaboration.
Right. They start thinking long-term about the overall success of the company.
Okay, so how do you actually make this ownership thing happen?
Well, SRC initially wanted to give shares to every employee right away,
Uh-huh.
but there were a lot of legal and logistical problems with that. So they ended up developing 3 different ways for employees to earn ownership over time.
Okay, so they found a way to make it work.
They did. And he tells this great story about a debate they had.
What was it about?
They had to decide whether to take a bonus right away or wait until they hit all their targets for the year.
Tough choice.
It was. But about 60% of the employees, including many senior people who already had a lot of equity, chose to wait.
Wow.
They were prioritizing the long-term health of the company over their own short-term gain.
That's impressive.
Right. It shows a real ownership mentality. He also tells a story about a group of senior employees who took on the challenge of introducing 100 new products in just 3 months to avoid layoffs.
That's a huge undertaking.
It was. But they did it because they felt responsible for their colleagues, you know?
Yeah. It's amazing what people can do when they feel like they're part of something bigger.
It really is. And finally, Stack talks about democracy in business. He says it's not just about voting, it's about education.
Okay.
People need to understand how the business works to participate in a meaningful way.
Right. If they don't understand, they can't really make informed decisions.
Exactly. When SRC was planning to decentralize, they went out of their way to get input from employees at all levels. So it's about giving people the knowledge and understanding they need to be a real part of the decision-making process.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so towards the end of the book, Stack has this section called The Ultimate Hire Law, a message to middle managers and everyone. What's he talking about in this final part?
This part really focuses on one of the biggest challenges businesses face today: rising healthcare costs.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And Stack tells a story about an employee whose young son had a heart attack.
Oh,
And his first thought was, how are they going to afford the hospital bills?
that's heartbreaking.
It is. And it shows how this issue of healthcare costs, it's not just some abstract problem.
Right. It impacts real people's lives.
Exactly. And Stack says the solution is to start thinking differently and to make sure everyone in the company understands how the business works.
Okay.
He's talking about education, taking responsibility, getting rid of excuses,
Right.
and really using those principles we talk about: benchmarking, standards, cost control, accountability, all that stuff. He thinks that if more companies adopt these principles, it will actually make society better as a whole.
So he's saying these business principles can be applied to improve the world.
Exactly. And he has this great analogy about fishing.
Okay.
He says everyone gets the same number of bites, opportunities in life and business.
Uh-huh.
But the difference between success and failure is how well you prepare.
Okay.
Understanding the rules, knowing the numbers, and then how focused you are when those opportunities come along.
So it's not just about getting the opportunity, it's about what you do with it.
Exactly. And he uses the example of Zenith, a company that failed because they just kept downsizing and lowering their standards.
Instead of empowering their people.
Right. They didn't invest in their workforce.
Mm.
And Stack really believes that the purpose of a business is to create jobs.
So layoffs should be a last resort.
Exactly. He sees it as a failure of leadership. He also talks about the hunger for ownership he sees in people
Okay.
and how positive the response was at SRC when they started letting employees create their own businesses within the company. He also points out how emerging capitalist nations can learn from the mistakes of more developed countries.
Right. They can learn from our successes and failures.
Exactly. And he really drives home the point that the whole purpose of the great game of business is to get everyone aligned around the same goals and to make the company run smoothly.
Right. No more unnecessary drama and conflict.
Yeah. And he ends on a hopeful note. Even if your whole company isn't on board with this GGOB thing, you can still create your own little island of sanity.
Island of sanity.
Yeah, just by implementing these ideas in your own area. You might not be able to change the whole company, but you can make a difference where you are.
That's a great point.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key things you'd want our listeners to remember about the great game of business?
The biggest takeaway for me is that it's not just a bunch of random tips or tricks. It's a complete system based on being transparent with your financials and educating your employees.
Yeah,
It's about setting clear goals, having good incentives, and creating a culture of ownership where everyone feels invested in the company's success.
and the story of SRC really shows how powerful these ideas can be, right?
Yeah, I mean, going from a 10-cent stock price to where they are today, that's amazing.
Incredible growth.
So, as you're listening to this, think about this. Is there an area in your work or even in your personal life where you could apply some of these principles? Like, could you be more transparent, set clearer goals, or give people a greater sense of ownership?
It makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how can we turn challenges into a game where everyone understands the rules and can share in the wins?
Exactly. And if any of this has resonated with you, we highly recommend checking out Jack Stack's The Great Game of Business. It's a book that has clearly had a big impact on a lot of people for good reason.
Definitely worth a read.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.